Thank you very much for a very warm welcoming at the beginning of this session. I'm really happy to have this presentation to you. And let me pass immediately to the point with stating a problem and several introductory information. The chapter 17 of the second book of Kings presents the history of last years of the Northern Kingdom. In my presentation, I would like to examine the semantic and syntactic aspects of the verse 5 of this chapter, which, as we will see, are somehow problematic. The vast number of its renderings reveals that there is no consensus on its interpretation among scholars. It indicates that in spite of an apparent simplicity of the Hebrew in this verse, it presents some difficulty. So, consulting commentaries and articles on second book of Kings 17:5, as well as Bible translations, we can find a variety of renderings so that it is quite hard to find two identical ones. It indicates that our verse is somehow problematic, since it provokes different interpretations and, in consequence, different translations. What I'm going to deal here with is a perceived meaning of this verse, since I use translations of the Hebrew text as a basis. At this point, I should start with an important premise that studying a text written many centuries ago and so separated from its author or redactor, we do not have direct access to the so-called authorial meaning of the text. It is, in fact, only the author who can ultimately and authoritatively remove any confusion regarding his text's understanding. I refer to here to the manual of Cottrell and Turner on linguistics and biblical interpretation, as you can see on the slide. All we as readers and hearers of ancient scriptures can do is to examine meaning of the text with careful consideration of its co-text and context. What I am now going to deal with, however, is just another type of meaning that emerges from a text. It is a perceived meaning, namely the meaning which is grasped by the reader or hearer. In our case, it would be, or it is, the translator of the text. We may find a trace of it in any translation that to some extent is always a kind of interpretation. And this is in fact the essence of the matter. The variety of different renderings of the single verse reflects the variety of meanings which are perceived. It indicates that our verse is somehow complex. I will identify its difficulty by comparing numerous renderings of 2 Kings 17:5 with each other in order to recognize the problem that lies behind the semantics and syntax of this verse. I examined altogether 44 different renderings of this verse, drawn out from 18 commentaries, 2 articles, and 24 Bible translations. These renderings can be next divided into 12 groups. For clarity of my exposition, I will first point out the criteria according to which I made these subdivisions. Then I will explain them in detail. Okay, let me go. I have a doubled one. Okay. In order to present the collected data systematically, we should first single out 3 coordinated clauses in this verse, each one introduced by the verb form of vayiktor. Vaya'al melech Ashur bechol haaretz, vaya'al shomeron, vayatzach alecha shalosh shanim. These are, in fact, 3 actions of the Assyrian king that unfold the plot of the verse. Nevertheless, the semantics and syntax of this verse seem to be very simple, with no use of problematic vocabulary or unexpected grammatical forms, these three individual clauses are rendered differently in translations by expressing a large range of shades of meaning. As we will further see in detail, the meaning of the first clause is perceived in 5 different ways. One second, please. Okay, the second clause in 3 different ways. Only the perceived meaning of the third one is generally the same in all consulted translations. A combination of all possible renderings of the first and the second clause gives us theoretically 15 different translations of this single verse. I will further narrow them down to 12, and effectively I have found altogether 10 different translations of this single verse. So let's go now into some details. The first clause is composed of a simple predicate, vaya'al, a subject, melech Ashur, and a prepositional phrase being here an adverbial modifier of place, bechol haaretz. Nonetheless, we deal here with the basic vocabulary, Hebrew vocabulary. The syntactic relation between vaya'al and bechol haaretz leaves much space for varied interpretations. I categorized all the consulted renderings into 5 groups according to the meaning that is understood. I marked them respectively with numbers, as you can see, from 1 to 5. The diagram shows that we can note among them an increasing degree with which the military aggression of the Assyrian king is perceived, from the most neutral statement of his coming up through a whole country, number 1, to that one that clearly expresses his invasion of the entire land. The first set of renderings, so number 1, denotes a simple action of traversing the land. It combines the literal meaning of the verb Allah with the spatial sense of the preposition beth, which marks an area moved through. Such translations do not allude to the military attack, and we may call them the neutral ones. In the second, so maybe let's go back to this slide before going further. The second set of renderings, so number 2, the meaning of the verb Allah is perceived as a military action. The English verb to march implies in this context a kind of war maneuvers. These translations retain, however, the spatial sense of the preposition back, so going through. The next one, so number 3, expresses the literal meaning of the verb Allah and the adversative sense of the preposition back. Some other renderings denote more explicitly a military action of the Assyrians, so number 4. The preposition beth is interpreted there as denoting an adversative meaning against. For simplicity of my exposition, I will treat these 2 groups, 3 and 4, together, since they differ only slightly from each other. These renderings of the renderings of the last group are even more explicit. The king's coming in the country is interpreted as an invasion just from the beginning of the verse. By singling out these sets of renderings, we have already gained an important pointer to identify the difficulty of the verse. The diagram illustrates how different comprehension and interpretation of the verb Allah and of the preposition beth may lead to varied translations. And so, on the one hand, we deal with polysemy of the verb Allah, and the question is, which meaning of this lexeme is the most appropriate to our text and its context? And on the other hand, with the syntactic relation between this verb and the adverbial modifier bechol haaretz, or more specifically with the preposition beth. And so, should it be understood spatially, going through, or adversatively, going against? In order to respond to the aforementioned questions, the semantic and syntactic aspects of the whole clause have to be studied very carefully. I have prepared other slides just to show in detail these four renderings. I based my research on the modern translations, but here you can see also the ancient translations. So the Greek kaige goes very closely to the Masoretic text here, but the problem with this ancient translation, also according to Targum of Jonathan, is that the polysemic text is translated again in a very polysemic way. So here the Greek translation is not very helpful to determine the exact meaning of the phrase. So this is the first set of renderings where the action of traversing the land is underlined. In the second one, the verb Allah is given a military nuance, but very slightly. In the third, Allah receives the adversative sense, and the preposition beth again is interpreted as an adversive adverb, so against. The same is in rendering number 4, and number 5, as you can see, is present in many Bible translations and commentaries, so it's the most common, and it expresses in the most explicit way a military action of the Assyrians. Let's go now to some preliminary conclusion, because just at this point we can see what we are talking about, that different comprehension and interpretation of the verb Allah and the preposition beth may lead to varied translations. So the question we should point, which meaning of these lexemes is the most appropriate to the text in its co-text and context? And the second question, what syntactic relation is established between the verb and its adverbial modifier? In this case, it's bechol haaretz. And we should postulate always the semantic and syntactic aspects of the clause that have to be studied very carefully. I will return to these conclusions at the end of my presentation. So let's go now to the second clause. It is composed of a simple predicate and its direct object. Again, even if this phrase seems to be devoid of difficulty at first glance, its syntax leaves much space for varied interpretations. I divided all the consulted renderings, as you can see, into 3 groups marked with A, B, and C letters. These 3 sets, into which I grouped the consulted translations of our verse, show that the military expedition of the Assyrian king is perceived with varied intensity due to the different understanding of the meaning of the verb Allah. So the same question as in the previous case, and of its syntactic relation to the object, direct object shomeron. Renderings marked with a letter A interpret our verb with its basic meaning of coming up, and the noun shomeron as the object of the Assyrian king's movement, namely as his reaching point. So these translations remain on this physical layer or meaning of the lexeme. Translations of the second type marked with B adds to the basic meaning of our verb a nuance of a military action directed against Samaria. And the interpretations of the third type denote more explicitly the Assyrian attack on Samaria. So we can observe again an increasing degree of intensity with which the invasion of the Assyrians is perceived. It is caused again by semantic polysemy of the verb Allah and by its ambivalent syntactic relation with the noun shomeron. When it comes to the third clause, we don't have, it is less problematic. We don't have so much polysemy here. It doesn't give rise to semantic and syntactic difficulties. It is unanimously translated in the same way. In consequence, there is no need for further divisions of consulted renderings into groups. We should also note that the present clause is a kind of climax describing a concrete military action directed against the city of Samaria. So it's siege that lasted 3 years. And let me pass now to the narrative dynamics that is underlined by these different renderings of the verse. So we should now take into consideration the verse as a whole. As we already mentioned, 5 different types of renderings of the first clause, 3 types of the second clause, and generally unanimous renderings of the third one give us theoretically 15 possible ways in which this single verse is understood and in consequence translated. We may narrow down this number to 12 combinations if we treat together renderings marked with number 3 and 4. Among the consulted translations of the verse, I identified effectively 10 out of 12 possible combinations. I will examine now to which extent such combinations determine the narrative dynamics of the whole verse. I will attempt to visualize it on diagrams. So on the diagram that you will see in a second, the horizontal axis will indicate linearly the sequence of clauses in this verse, marked with 1, 2, and 3, reflecting the sequence of events that unfold the plot of the verse. And then the vertical axis will point out the degree of intensity with which the invasion is perceived, namely from an action from a neutral and non-military renderings at the bottom of the axis to the most explicit ones at its top. I'm sure it will be very clear when you see these diagrams. So first, the renderings that combine verse 5a marked with number 1 with verse 5b marked with the letter A. So these narratives, the narrative tension arises slowly in such translations. The Assyrian king's coming up through the whole land and his arrival in Samaria is not explicitly intended as a military attack. Only the final statement about the siege dispels any illusion of his peaceful expedition. When we see the renderings marked by number 1 and B, we see that the reader perceives the king's coming to Samaria as a military activity, and it concentrates on the invasion of the Israel's capital. Next, the combination of number 1 and C produce another and more expressive narrative dynamics. Such an interpretation, after a brief note of the king's traversing the whole land, mentions immediately his intention to attack the city, so that again the Assyrian aggression concentrates on the city of Samaria. Let's look now at the renderings of verse 5a marked as number 2, and again in combination with verse 5b marked with the letter A, B, and C. Such an interpretation is no more as neutral as a simple statement of the kings going up through the country. It is nevertheless true that the military activity in those renderings is intended implicitly. Translations combining number one with letters A, B, C gain slightly different narrative dynamics in relation to those discussed before. I did not find any translation that would put together number two and the letter A. The interpretation of number two and letter B can be found in Becking's work. According to him, the Assyrian kings marching through the entire country foreruns the fate of its capital. Translations that combine number two and letter C are more explicit and expressive. Even before the king's arrival in the city, its destiny seems to be already determined. So yet another narrative dynamics we can find in renderings 3 and 4 when it comes to verse 5a, in combination with letters A, B, C when it comes to the letter 5b. So these interpretations express clearly that the Assyrian expedition means nothing but war. This thread, being present just from the beginning of the verse, may be considered as slightly suspended by statement that he reached to Samaria in verse 5b. The diagrams show this small suspense in the first case. The most expressive narrative is represented by translations of number 5. So 5 refers to the first part of the verse, and A, B, and C to the second part of the verse. Such translations make explicit from the very beginning of the verse that the Assyrian coming up means a military aggression directed first against the whole country, namely the territory surrounding the capital city of Samaria. As a result, the narrative plot reaches its peak at the very beginning. If verse 5b is understood as a report of the Assyrian kings reaching or coming up to Samaria, the narrative again receives here a kind of suspense. So it's a kind of pause in the narrative. Translations that present such a narrative dynamics combine number 5 and A, as you can see on the diagram. They are most frequent ones. I noticed 16 out of 44 consulted translations that denote this kind of dynamic. After the first mention of the king's invasion in verse 5a, the narrative gains a moment of rest, as I said, a breather, before it continues with the report on the accomplishments of the invaders' plans. Okay, I see that my time is running out, so let me go to the conclusions and some final evaluation. So, summing up, we should note that varied translations of the verse, once again, I stress that I found already altogether 10 different renderings or kinds of renderings of this verse. This plurality of renderings is of course provoked by different interpretations of the verb Allah and syntactic relation to the phrases such as Bechol Haaretz and Shomron. It is interesting to observe that in the majority of consulted translation, the first clause, Vayal Bechol Haaretz, is understood in a military way, whereas the second one, Vayal Shomron, the same verb in the same phrase is very often interpreted in a physical way, like only the reaching of the point or the point of the king's arrival. Commentators, however, offer neither justification nor explanation for their choice. Moreover, it is all the same interesting to know that different interpretation of individual clauses of our verse produce in effect its different narrative dynamics. So we may think about rhetoric that is that is underlined by the text. Many of the commentators point towards the anti-Sumerian rhetoric that may be present in that kind of renderings. And evaluation, the last slide before saying thank you to you. So I evoke here the article I wrote on the semantic relation between Allah and Bet. I partially refer to it. But concerning the renderings that I consulted, in my opinion, you can see it on the diagram, translation of verse 5a marked with number 2 are the closest ones to the meaning intended in the text. This is the fruit of my semantic and syntactic research, because the verb here denotes the technical military meaning, and bet retains its spatial meaning, so the military action going through the land, not directed against the land in an adversative meaning. Those renderings marked with number 1 I would consider as difficult to accept, since they, besides the spatial meaning of the preposition, express the physical aspect of the verb only, so namely, king went up. These translations do not take into account the technical military sense of the verbs. Sets of renderings marked with 3, 4, and 5 present the text that denotes the technical meaning of the verb Allah, but they interpret the preposition bet in an adversative way, which is here debatable. With respect to verse 5b, I argue that the sets of renderings marked with B and C, denoting the technical military meaning of the verb Allah, are acceptable, since such a sense is unquestionable in the context. I argue that the renderings marked with letter A are rather unacceptable, since only the physical aspect of the verb is expressed there. I do not find grounds for stating that the verb Allah in verse 5a occurs in the technical military meaning, but in verse 5b, so just next to it, it doesn't, since they refer to the same ongoing military operation. In addition, we should note that the parallel passage in 2 Kings 18:9 presents the plain formulation of this technical term, Allah al-Shomron, and so the technical military meaning of the verb should be rendered here. With respect to verse 5c, we need to keep in mind that it doesn't give rise to any difficulty, and it is translated unanimously. Concluding, I claim that the best rendering of verse 5 should combine the meaning marked with number 2 in relation to verse 5a, and that marked with letters B and C in relation to verse 5b. The schema, as you can see, presents my general appraisal of consulted renderings.